Something happened to the army that was supposed to conquer Ukraine in 3 days that the Kremlin has spent 4 years trying to hide behind carefully managed casualty numbers, state media blackouts, and the blurred satellite imagery of military cemeteries that have quietly expanded to sizes that contradict every official statement Moscow has made about the cost of this war. What has happened to Russia's military is not a story about tactical failures or logistical shortcomings or the unexpected resilience of a smaller adversary. Those things are all true, but they are not the deepest truth. The deepest truth is this. The army that Vladimir Putin sent into Ukraine in February 2022, believing it was the second most powerful military force on earth, has been so comprehensively destroyed, so systematically hollowed out at every level, from its most elite special operations units down to the barely trained conscripts being rushed through weeks-long training programs before being sent to die in Donetsk, that what remains in 2026 bears almost no meaningful resemblance to the force that crossed the border 4 years ago. Russia has not just lost soldiers. Russia has lost the institutional military knowledge, the combat experience, the specialized capability, and the command competence that took decades to build, and that cannot be reconstructed in any time frame relevant to the war it is currently fighting and slowly, measurably, mathematically losing. Here is the number that frames everything that follows. Approximately 1.3 million Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded over the course of this war. 1.3 million. That figure, drawn from estimates across multiple independent tracking organizations and cross-referenced against the pension payment data, regional obituary records, and cemetery expansion timelines that Russian authorities have tried and failed to fully suppress, represents a scale of military attrition not seen in Europe since the Second World War. No army handles losses of that magnitude without fundamental structural degradation. Not even an army drawing from a population of 143 million people with a recruitment apparatus that has demonstrated a disturbing ability to keep feeding men into a conflict that keeps consuming them faster than they can be replaced. But the raw casualty number, devastating as it is, does not capture the specific and irreversible quality of what Russia has lost. Because not all casualties are equal in their consequences for military capability. A regular infantry soldier killed on the front line is a tragedy by any human measure and a significant operational cost. But regular infantry can be replaced through recruitment and basic training on timelines that are painful but manageable. What cannot be replaced on any timeline that matters, what takes not months but years and decades to build, what represents the accumulated product of selection processes, specialized training programs, combat experience, and institutional knowledge that is embedded in specific human beings rather than in manuals or equipment, is elite soldiers. And Russia's elite soldiers are gone. To understand what that loss actually means, you have to understand what Russia's elite forces were, what they were built to do, and why their destruction represents a qualitatively different kind of military damage than the staggering but theoretically replaceable losses among regular infantry units. Russia's airborne forces, the VDV, were for decades regarded as one of the finest paratrooper formations on the planet. Not regarded that way by Russian propaganda alone, though Russian propaganda certainly celebrated them enthusiastically. Regarded that way by Western military analysts who tracked their performance in Chechnya, Georgia, and Syria with the professional attention that capable adversaries command. VDV soldiers featured prominently in Russian military recruitment campaigns, not because they were photogenic, though the imagery was certainly designed to be, but because they represented a genuine capability. Rapid deployment behind enemy lines, seizure of strategic assets before conventional forces could respond, disruption of command and logistics networks that degraded the enemy's ability to organize a coherent defense. These were real operational capabilities built on real training, real selection standards, and the real combat experience that accumulates when elite units are used carefully and for missions suited to their specific skills. What happened to those capabilities in Ukraine is one of the defining military disasters of the 21st century, and it began in the opening hours of the invasion. Russia deployed VDV paratroopers to Hostomel Airport in the opening days of the conflict, less than 10 kilometers from Kiev. The mission was to seize the airport, secure a lodgment for follow-on forces, and enable the rapid decapitation of the Ukrainian government that Russian operational planning apparently assumed would collapse the Ukrainian will to resist before serious fighting could develop. Ukraine had anticipated exactly this. Ukrainian forces were waiting. The paratroopers who landed at Hostomel were ambushed, surrounded, and destroyed. Hundreds of VDV personnel were killed in a matter of days in an operation that was supposed to demonstrate Russian elite military capability, and instead demonstrated the catastrophic gap between Russian operational planning assumptions and Ukrainian defensive reality. That was the beginning. What followed across 4 years of grinding attritional warfare was the systematic consumption of the VDV in roles fundamentally incompatible with their training, their equipment, and their doctrine. By 2023, the Russian Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky stated publicly that approximately 8,500 paratroopers had been wounded and that around 50% of Russia's 30,000 airborne troops had been killed or injured. 50%. Half of one of Russia's premier military formations. Casualties sustained not the kind of rapid decisive operations that VDV doctrine was built around, but in frontal assaults on fortified Ukrainian positions in Zaporizhzhia, Avdiivka, Pokrovsk, and a dozen other locations where the paratroopers were used not as a scalpel for precision operations, but as a hammer for breaking positions that Russia's regular infantry had failed to break at even greater cost. Since those 2023 figures, the VDV has continued to take casualties in every subsequent offensive operation, at every contested location where Russian commanders needed shock troops capable of absorbing enormous losses without immediately routing. The force that existed in February 2022 no longer exists in any operationally meaningful sense. The Spetsnaz, Russia's special purpose forces with a global reputation built on decades of clandestine operations, direct action missions, and the kind of specialized capabilities that conventional military forces simply cannot replicate, have suffered a parallel and equally irreversible destruction. According to the 2023 Pentagon leaks, approximately 900 Spetsnaz operators were initially deployed to Ukraine. 775 were killed or wounded. That is an 86% casualty rate among an elite force that by any professional military standard should be deployed in ways that minimize their exposure to the kind of attritional warfare that produces those numbers. Spetsnaz soldiers are not supposed to be used in frontal assaults on defended positions. They are supposed to be used for operations where their specific skills, reconnaissance, sabotage, high-value target elimination, enable effects disproportionate to their numbers. Throwing them into Ukraine's meat grinder represents not just a tactical misuse, but a strategic catastrophe whose consequences will outlast the war itself. By 2025, reporting from Mediazona, which has established itself as one of the most reliable and methodologically rigorous sources for tracking confirmed Russian casualties through official obituaries and death records, placed the confirmed Spetsnaz death toll at over 1,000. 1,000 of Russia's most carefully selected, most expensively trained, most operationally irreplaceable soldiers confirmed dead. The actual number is almost certainly higher. Russia's naval infantry, the Marines, represent a third pillar of elite capability that has been similarly consumed. These were units with genuine combat pedigree, experience from Syria's coastal operations, from amphibious training that had produced formations like the 40th, 61st, 155th, and 810th Brigades that carried reputations within the Russian military that were not simply manufactured by state media. In the early phases of the Ukraine invasion, they contributed to the encirclement and eventual capture of Mariupol in operations that, whatever the moral horror of what occurred in that city, demonstrated genuine combined arms competence at the tactical level. Since Mariupol, the trajectory of Russia's naval infantry has been one of progressive destruction and forced reconstitution that has left these brigades as shadows of what they once were. The 155th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade has undergone no fewer than 8 separate restructures over the course of the war, each reconstitution following a round of losses that depleted the Amur Brigade to the point where it could no longer function as a coherent combat formation. The 810th has been reconstituted multiple times following losses in Mariupol, Kherson, Kursk, and Zaporizhzhia. By 2026, Mediazona's confirmed death tracking places naval infantry losses at over 2,200 killed in the first 4 years of the war. For context, that figure exceeds the total American military deaths across 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Russia's naval infantry lost more confirmed dead in 4 years than America lost in 2 decades. But the quantitative destruction of these elite formations, devastating as it is only part of the story. The qualitative destruction, the erosion of the institutional culture, the command competence, the tactical innovation, and the professional discipline that makes elite forces elite rather than simply well-equipped regular infantry, is in some ways more consequential and more irreversible than the numerical losses. Elite units do not derive their effectiveness primarily from their equipment, though equipment matters. They derive it from the accumulated professional culture of formations that select the best candidates, train them to the highest standards, deploy them in ways that build rather than burn experience, and maintain the institutional memory that allows tactical lessons to propagate through the unit and improve performance over time. That culture cannot survive the kind of losses and operational misuse that Russia's elite forces have experienced. when 50% of your paratroopers have been killed or wounded, when your special forces operators are being used as assault infantry, when your Marine brigades are being reconstituted for the 8th time, the institutional culture that distinguished those formations from regular infantry has been destroyed along with the personnel who embodied it. What replaces that culture under the pressure of a war that demands continuous replacements is not a reconstituted elite. It is a degraded approximation of one. New recruits rushed through shortened training programs and embedded in nominally elite units to make up the numbers. Officers promoted to fill positions vacated by casualties without the experience or mentorship that would normally precede that advancement. Commanders making decisions based on doctrine that was developed for a different kind of force in a different kind of operational environment, applying it to a situation that those doctrines were never designed to address. The result is a force that carries the name and the organizational structure of an elite unit while lacking the substance that made the name meaningful. Russia's military has become a hollow replica of itself, performing the organizational theater of a great military power while its actual combat capability degrades with every week the war continues. The corruption dimension of this collapse adds a layer of dysfunction that compounds every other form of degradation in ways that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore in any honest assessment of what Russia's military has become. The leaked messages to Russian government websites documenting 12,000 complaints in a single 6-month period, accusing commanders of corruption and violence against their own troops, describe a military culture that has not just failed to maintain the professional standards that elite forces require, but has actively inverted them. Commanders operating extortion schemes against soldiers under their command, price lists for assignments that reduce exposure to frontline combat, $2,000 for a drone operator position, $6,000 to serve in the rear, $12,000 for a medical discharge. Soldiers from poor economic backgrounds joining the military because they needed money to support their families and finding themselves pressured to surrender up to 80% of their salaries just to avoid being sent on suicidal assaults. Torture used routinely as a management tool, with videos circulating on social media showing soldiers locked in cages, tied to trees, electrocuted, beaten, forced to strip and freezing. Temperatures, or ordered to fight each other in improvised pit fights. This is not the behavior of a military that is winning. This is not even the behavior of a military that believes it can win. This is the behavior of a military that has lost the internal coherence, the shared purpose, and the institutional trust that any functional fighting force requires as its operational foundation. When soldiers are paying their commanders for the privilege of not being killed, when the relationship between officer and enlisted has been reduced to a predatory transaction, when the chain of command has become a mechanism for extraction rather than a structure for coordinating combat power, the army that results cannot fight effectively regardless of how many men are added to its roles. The command culture problem extends beyond individual corruption into the structural Soviet inheritance that Russia's military has never successfully shed. Elite unit commanders in the Russian system do not have the authority or operational freedom to make the most of the troops they command. Doctrine built around Soviet-era micromanagement at every level of the hierarchy requires decisions to be elevated to commanders who are physically distant from the tactical situation, operating from information that is hours old, and applying doctrinal templates that assume a different kind of battlefield than the drone-saturated, sensor-dense environment that Ukraine has created in Donetsk and across the southern axis. The result is a mismatch between the decision-making speed that modern warfare requires and the institutional authorization structure that Russian military culture permits. Elite units that could, in theory, adapt, innovate, and find solutions to the tactical problems Ukraine presents are instead waiting for permission from commanders who do not fully understand the situation and cannot receive accurate information quickly enough to make timely decisions. The personnel quality trajectory of the Russian military in 2026 tells the story of an institution consuming itself from the top down and the inside out simultaneously. The progression that has characterized Russian recruitment as the war has extended reveals the depth of the manpower crisis that underlies everything else. The initial mobilization drew on reservists with some prior military experience. When those reservists were consumed, the recruitment turned to volunteers, motivated by increasingly large financial incentives that have strained regional budgets across Russia. When financial incentives proved insufficient, the recruitment apparatus turned to prison populations, offering pardons to convicts in exchange for frontline service. When the prison pipeline proved inadequate, reports emerged of people with terminal illnesses being mobilized, individuals with missing limbs being dispatched to frontline locations, and ethnic minorities being tricked or pressured into service through deliberately misleading recruitment materials. Russia has been recruiting African mercenaries and negotiating with North Korea for troop contributions that brought approximately 10,000 North Korean soldiers to the conflict. soldiers who have taken significant casualties in operations around Kursk, while demonstrating limited ability to operate effectively in the Ukrainian tactical environment. The critical threshold that changes everything about the sustainability of Russia's military campaign was crossed in the early months of 2026. Russia began losing more soldiers than it was able to recruit, not temporarily, structurally. The pipeline of replacements has become insufficient to cover the losses being generated by the operational tempo that Russian commanders are maintaining across the Donetsk front. The math of this imbalance is not immediately catastrophic in the way that a sudden defeat would be. It is the kind of slow structural deterioration that produces eventual collapse through accumulation rather than sudden rupture. Each month that Russia loses more soldiers than it recruits, its frontline units become slightly thinner, slightly less capable, slightly more dependent on the kind of mass assault tactics that substitute bodies for capability and produce the 316 casualties per square kilometer figure that Ukraine's military has documented in Donetsk. Ukraine, meanwhile, is moving in the opposite direction on every relevant metric. Drone production has accelerated to the point where Ukraine is now deploying 30% more strike drones than Russia across multiple front sectors. Long-range missile capability has expanded through Western weapons deliveries. Combat experience among Ukrainian units that have been fighting continuously for 4 years has produced tactical competence at the squad and platoon level that was not present in the Ukrainian military of 2022, and that the Russian military, for all its losses and reconstitutions, has not been able to match. Ukrainian military commanders are projecting the capacity to inflict up to 50,000 casualties on Russian forces per month as drone production continues to scale and deep strike capability continues to develop. 50,000 casualties per month against a Russian military that is already losing more soldiers than it can recruit represents an attrition rate that no force of Russia's current size and composition can sustain. The war crimes. Dimension of Russia's elite force degradation adds a moral dimension that is inseparable from the military analysis because the behavior of elite units in combat reflects and amplifies the culture of the force that employs them. Both the 155th and 810th Guards Naval Infantry Brigades have been accused of using banned chemical substances against Ukrainian forces and executing Ukrainian prisoners of war in violation of every applicable international legal standard. VDV paratroopers are implicated in the Bucha massacre of 2022, the documented slaughter of Ukrainian civilians that produced photographic and forensic evidence so overwhelming that the debate about what happened has been settled by the physical record. These are not allegations against rogue individuals operating outside the knowledge of their commanders. They are patterns of behavior across multiple elite units that reflect the institutional culture that 4 years of misuse, attrition, and leadership failure have produced in formations that once claimed professional military standards as a point of pride. The humiliation embedded in this story goes beyond battlefield defeats and casualty numbers. It is the humiliation of a military mythology that Russia built over decades and invested enormous resources in maintaining. The mythology of the VDV as an invincible rapid deployment force capable of decisive action behind enemy lines. The mythology of the Spetsnaz as a shadow army of professionals capable of achieving what conventional forces could not. The mythology of the naval infantry as a proven amphibious assault force that had demonstrated its worth in every conflict Russia had fought in the modern era. All of these mythologies served real strategic purposes beyond domestic propaganda. They created deterrence, uncertainty in the minds of adversaries who could not be certain that they were accurately assessing Russian capability. They supported Russia's claim to great power status in a world where military capability remains the ultimate currency of geopolitical weight. They justified the defense, spending that built and maintained the forces that embodied the mythology. The war in Ukraine has not just damaged those forces, it has destroyed the mythology in a way that cannot be reconstructed through any propaganda campaign, any military reform program, or any announcement of new weapon systems. The world has watched the VDV destroyed at Hostomel. It has watched the Spetsnaz consumed in frontal assaults they were never designed for. It has watched the naval infantry reconstituted 8 times in brigades that returned to the front line as shadows of what they once were. The second strongest army on earth has been weighed on the scale of actual combat against an adversary it was supposed to overwhelm in 3 days. The weight it registered was not what the label said, and the whole world saw the reading. Russia's military elite is gone. Not weakened, not depleted, gone. And what fills the space where that elite used to stand is a conscript army running on financial coercion, commanded by officers running extortion schemes, deployed in suicidal assaults that produce casualty rates not seen in Europe since the Second World War, against an enemy that grows stronger, more capable, and more lethal with every month that the math of attrition continues to run in Ukraine's direction. The the second strongest army in the world, 0 elite units left. The humiliation is not coming. It is already complete. The battlefield said so. The numbers confirm it. And the blurred satellite images of Russia's expanding military cemeteries are the Kremlin's silent acknowledgement that the story it has been telling about its military for decades was never as true as it needed to be.